Hello, dear listener. Today's date is 27 April 2014. My name is John Durish, and this is my audio presentation for the IRLS 492 Literature Review. Introduction. The research question for this literature review is as follows. Are urban areas the best haven for refugees and migrants, or is urbanization leading to new forms of conflict and adding complexity to international relations? This literature review will focus on the long-standing conflict between Israelis and Palestinians and will address the nexus of transnational and transitional justice and the growth of urbanization. These two areas underpin key aspects of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians since the end of World War II and stretch into modern times. Much of the literature review will explore the influx of Jewish settlers into areas abandoned by Arabs beginning in 1948 and extending until 1967, as well as the detailed planning which the early Israeli government put into place to assure a smooth transition for Jewish settlers migrating from around the globe, in particular from post-World War II Europe. This urban planning made little to no regard for displaced Arabs, setting the foundation for future conflicts. While Israeli urbanization has not resulted in the creation of other megacities around the globe, for example New York and Singapore, issues relating to transitional and transnational justice are creating conditions that are leading to ever-increasing levels of desperation. This desperation stems from many of the perceptions that surround the handling of justice and urbanization, such as the double standards that are applied to both Israeli and Palestinian forms of violence. Section 1. Overview of themes. There are three main themes within this literature review. They are urbanization and refugee flows, transitional and transnational justice, and the intangible but important perspectives of not only the parties involved, but external actors. The first theme is urbanization and refugee flows, discussed in two key articles. The first work is the article titled Jewish Settlement of Former Arab Towns and Their Incorporation into the Israeli Urban System from 1948 to 1950 by Arnon Golan. Arnon Golan's paper provides particularly useful insight into the, quote, brutal and abrupt transformation, unquote, of Palestinian land use. It describes how the majority of the Arab populace fled long-established communities beginning in 1948, expelled by Israeli forces. In doing so, they left behind farms, built-up terrain, and critical infrastructure. Golan gives great information about how Jewish immigrants continued to displace Arabs well into 1967 and beyond. The second article is Bad Neighbors, Bad Neighborhoods, an inquiry into the cause of refugee flows by Myron Weiner. In this article, Myron Weiner explores how governments have attempted to balance their own people's needs against those of refugees, as well as the threat that refugee populations can disrupt any state's integrity, economic health, and political and societal stability. Myron Weiner further highlights how global dynamics can cause states and international bodies to at the most intervene, or at least attempt to influence state actors to care for refugees or mitigate the factors that put people to flight in the first place, and hopefully help refugees return to their home territories. The second theme of transitional and transnational justice is discussed in two excellent books. The first book is titled Closing the Books, Transitional Justice in Historical Perspective by John Elster. John Elster highlights how transitional and transnational justice has had impacts on human security dating as far back as 403 BC, establishing norms in international relations. He discusses how changes of regimes bring about changes in society that can disaffect any people of a populace, notably rules governing lawsuits, rights to vote, assembly, and so forth. He further illustrates the readers on the establishment of legal norms during the French restorations of 1814 and 1815. Importantly, this was accomplished via negotiated transitions, which is a crucial aspect to the success for potential Israeli and Palestinian reconciliation. Additionally, John Elster discusses how European Jews had to work within post-World War II legal systems to try to get their property back, but often had to use rigorous arguments to gain back their property. These incidents likely had a tremendous impact on Jewish immigrants coming into Israel and will be explored in the literature review. In the most succinct of terms, the key contribution of the next work is the notion that international law is not true law, and that is a direct quote. This second book is Modern International Law, an Introduction to the Law of Nations by James Wolfe. It is James Wolfe, quote, international law is not true law, unquote, idea that is a harsh reality that underpins many of the issues which surround the impact of urbanization within the Israeli and Palestinian territories. This is a part of the theme of transitional and transnational justice that presents the most significant voids which beg exploration. The third and final theme is the intangible but important perspectives of not only the parties involved, but external actors such as the United Nations and the United States. This theme appears in all of the works in this literature review, but in particular it appears in the following three works. The first is the book The Challenge of Third World Development by Howard Handelman. Handelman presents the most relevant perspective, that of the individual. He explores why urban areas swell and why human security and justice is important to resolving the long-standing conflicts between Israelis and Palestinians. His primary contribution is the idea that, quote, despairing of any hope for a better life in the countryside and seeking new opportunities for themselves and their children, millions of villagers leave the world they have known for the uncertainties of the city, unquote. This phenomenon is occurring on a global scale, and Handelman presents the data that shows that in 2008 the total urban population passed the total rural population. The second work is the book Human Rights Horizons, The Pursuit of Justice in a Globalizing World by Richard Falk. Falk heavily indemnifies the modern international discourse on Israeli-Palestinian relations, highlighting the double standard regarding Israeli versus Palestinian security. He describes the common global perception that Palestinian violence is tantamount to terrorism, while Israeli violence is habitually painted with the brush of necessity born from a need for Israel's security. This causes any use of violence by Palestinians to appear as an act that, quote, undermines whatever political and moral claims may exist to support the Palestinian struggle, unquote. And the final work that will be a part of this literature review is the article Contradictions and Dialectics, Reshaping Political Space in Israel-Palestine by Oren Yiftachel. Yiftachel weaves emotionally charged poetry from Palestinian writers that shows their grim determination to reclaim the lands they feel entitled to, and keep the lands they have control of. Oren describes in stark terms the causes of the various intifadas, which have been accompanied, quote, by growing polarization between a Palestinian minority inside Israel and the state, unquote. Yiftachel's work is the most personal of the three of the literature review, discussing in direct language the long-term effects of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinian Arabs as they try to resolve, peacefully at times, but frequently through violence, the issues that propagate the struggle for a home that has lasted since the end of World War II and shows little sign of abatement. Section 2, Literature Review, Gaps in Knowledge. There are two fundamental gaps in knowledge within this topic with which future research will have to contend. The first, and perhaps most critical, is Wolfe's notion that, quote, international law is not true law, unquote. Absent a truly global, hegemonic, and ruling power, each state is left to its own legal devices. Worse still, the long-standing ill will and perceptions of right and wrong are frequently glossed over not by rational thought, but by dangerous and frequently religious rhetoric. This literature review seeks to pry past the front-page media and accusations of the Western and Islamic worlds against each other. It is clear, however, that the years of acrimony and religious dialectic has largely masked the true social issues of urbanization and transitional and transnational justice which impede peaceful resolution of this conflict. The second, and just as complex, gap in knowledge is the simple counting of human lives affected by displacement from conflict and expanding urban centers. Wiener astutely discusses how countries that produce migrants and refugees rarely do the best job of keeping accurate tallies, especially when those displacements and movements are within their own borders. Researchers are forced to rely upon figures created by countries that receive migrants and refugees, as well as hopefully those generated by agencies such as the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Additionally, the fine lines between migrants and refugees exacerbate efforts to accurately tally the impact of dislocated persons, with most persons falling outside established statistical systems. Section 3. The different sides of the debate. Each of the key themes has diametrically opposed sides. Within the theme of urbanization, the two sides are very clear and simple. The debate is split over which side, in this case Jew or Palestinian Arab, has the right to the land, and can benefit from the security of land ownership and the right to develop a better future. Within transitional and transnational justice, the debates are split between the myriad of precedents versus the absence of a truly international system of law that is agreed upon by all parties. And within the theme of perspectives, the range of debate is limitless. Perspective often creates reality, but this is hardly a true concept. Worse still is a debate between the perspectives of parties internal and external to the issues of urban development and the implementation of just approaches to conflict resolution. Section 4. The consensus and disagreement among the literature review authors. In the broadest sense, most of the literature in this review is highly complementary, but before highlighting the areas of consensus and disagreement, it is important to provide additional theoretical framework to unify the three thematic areas. To begin with, it is important to remember that most literature does not consider the Gaza Strip and the other areas occupied by the Palestinian Arabs within and around the Israeli state as a lesser developed country or as part of a so-called third world. This limbo-like status makes understanding the conflict over land usage problematic. All the same, these areas are affected by the same factors that most scholars acknowledge as critical to development. In particular, as Wiener notes, violent conflict in these regions is often typified by rapid population growth, land shortages stemming from said population growth, an excessive inventory of young people in a labor pool, degradation of the environment, and imbalances in economic standards. Next, this literature review is predicated heavily upon the long-term impacts of the end of World War II and the period which followed that witnessed some of the most staggering growth of refugee numbers, particularly from the European continent. Drawing attention again back to Wiener, the displacement of an estimated 30 million refugees and the sudden redrawing of European borders had profound effects on the world order, and while much of Europe managed to recover and settle into a new regional order, the effects of these massive displacements and transitional justice-related issues created a truly complex set of issues within the Jewish diaspora, the growth of the Israeli state, and the forced displacement of Palestinian Arabs. Lastly, and again, this is where the congruence of ideas between the authors of this literature review is best summed up by Handelman's observation that despair of hope will push peoples to migrate to urban centers, believing that a better life awaits them there. Section 5. Urbanization. Much of the literature on urbanization within the Israeli sphere is largely one-sided, owing simply to the fact that over the past 60 years, Israel has dictated the terms of development through might of force. The historical context of this theme is very important to understanding it. Prior to World War II and the conflict in 1948 in which the State of Israel was born, most Jews lived in urban centers. Golan notes that as far back as the Ottoman Empire, 62% of Jews were city dwellers. Golan further reveals that even as World War II was beginning, a meticulous plan was being formulated by Zionist socialists in 1939 to prepare for the growth of urban areas within Palestinian territories. Their desire was to ensure the even dispersal of Jewish immigrants. Whether intentionally or circumstantially, this plan was brought to fruition with the, quote, brutal and abrupt transformation, unquote, of Palestinian land use following the outbreak of hostilities between Jews and Arabs in 1948. The majority of Palestinian Arabs were forced to flee their homes and livelihoods. In doing so, they left behind farms, built-up terrain, and critical infrastructure. Of the estimated 690,000 Jewish immigrants between 1948 and 1951, Golan notes that 125,000 were placed by the central Israeli government into former Arab dwellings. Further, Golan makes clear that the Israeli government never had any intention of allowing the Arabs to take part in the future development of the Israeli state when, quote, many Jewish immigrants lived in anguish at immigrant transit camps, unquote. It was because of harsh conditions of transition camps that the Israeli government felt compelled to set up better living conditions for the Jewish immigrants, particularly coming on the heels of the disaster of the Holocaust in Nazi Germany. The Israeli state had to take swift actions to rapidly urbanize former Palestinian Arab lands. As both Golan and Wiener highlight, in a 4-year span following the outbreak of fighting in 1948, the Jewish populace doubled to 1.4 million. At the same time, according to Wiener, 1.9 million Palestinian Arab refugees were displaced within and without their homelands, a nearly and obscenely even match. In other words, one person moved in, one person moved out. It was the subsequent interstate warfare between Egypt and Israel that gave rise to one of the most poignant topics of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict debate, the habitation of the Gaza Strip. Golan describes how during this conflict most Palestinian Arabs were pushed out of the coastal plain except for the Gaza Strip. Golan also examines with great effect the strategic goal of Israeli urbanization plans to satisfy both military and economic needs. The entire area around Al-Majal in the coastal plain was repopulated with new Israelis to control crucial land routes into Tel Aviv. This was done to mitigate the ease of any Egyptian or Jordanian invasion, illustrating how urbanization can be used to achieve security goals. Further, Al-Majal also held the greatest economic growth prospects for the Israeli state at the time in the form of tourism and fishing industries. Thus, in addition to security, the Israelis displayed how economic needs can drive urbanization. By 1996, however, subsequent conflicts between Israel and neighboring states began to cease causing movements of refugees. As Wiener and Yiftachil point out, the Palestinian Arabs began to hunker down and wait out any fighting, vice running away from conflict. This period heralded the beginning of a new set of detrimental factors for Palestinian development. As Handelman points out, economies of lesser developed countries, including in this case the Gaza Strip, which in many regards is a state unto itself, often fail to provide adequate employment to urban workforces, leading to social tensions. Yiftachil provides further insight into the macroeconomic causes of this unfortunate fact, describing how the long-term effects of changing borders have created conditions ripe for urban stagnation. As Yiftachil notes, the quote, vast majority of territory and resources between Jordan and the sea are now controlled by Jews, while Palestinians, who comprise nearly half the population, are constrained to several quote-unquote self-governing enclaves covering about 15% of the land and lacking real sovereignty, freedom of movement, military power, control over water and air, or contiguous territory, unquote. With Palestinian conditions such as these dictating the terms of human security within Israeli and Palestinian territories, it quickly becomes clear how the impact of justice and perception will affect the course of the future for Jews and Arabs in the region. Section 6. Justice. At this point, the literature review must turn from the historical events that have led up to the current status quo and focus on the transitional and transnational justice issues that have, in a sense, allowed these events to take place. It is important to understand that while Jewish military force was a key factor in the ability of the Israeli state to grow, equally important were the laws which Jewish authorities enacted, as well as the effects of transitional justice in Europe following the end of World War II. John Elster's discussion of the history of transitional justice is crucial to understanding the key issues which surround conflicts such as those between Israelis and Palestinian Arabs. His examples of transitional justice dating back to several hundred years BC provide insight into the importance of legal recourse during regime changes. The ability to bring forth lawsuits, the right to vote and assembly, and other legal norms are important aspects of transitional justice. Elster also explains how more recent examples of the French restorations of 1814 and 1815 should also provide significant precedent for the returning of land to displaced persons. Despite these precedents, Israeli behavior in this context has been a highly convoluted stream of statist actions based upon both Jewish deprivations in Europe but also Arab reactions to their immigration en masse into Arab lands. Additionally, Weaver notes that issues surrounding citizenship, the implementation of national language standards, employment in the government sector, the right to education, and the control of police forces are also crucial to the ability of refugees and migrants to normalize, but these issues have remained seriously contentious in Israeli and Palestinian relations. Urbanization in former Palestinian lands has been profoundly affected by Israeli law. As described by Wiener, all Jews are effectively granted citizenship as soon as they immigrate. While other ethnic and racial blocs are generally accounted for when trying to determine the scope of refugee issues, Jews that fled into Israel during the second half of the 20th century from regions prone to conflict such as Iraq, Syria, and North Africa, as well as those who immigrated from the Soviet Union after its collapse, have all fallen under the law of return. Wiener provides statistical data that shows that approximately 500,000 Jews came from the Soviet Union to Israel during the period from 1990 to 1994 alone, but despite conditions that would likely categorize them as refugees in any other set of circumstances, they are merely seen as returnees. This potentially misleading form of categorization makes an effective analysis of Israeli urban planning problematic, creating norms that fall out of common theoretical frameworks surrounding urbanization-related research. Another key transitional and transnational justice-related issue is the legal treatment of Jews on the post-World War II European continent, which was likely a cause for their emigration. Elser illustrates that despite the cessation of the horrors committed by the Nazi German state against the European Jews, these Jews still had to work within the post-war legal systems to try to get their property back. This forced them to use rigorous arguments to gain back their property, but often to no avail. Legal norms in many European countries after the war created statutory limits that probably discouraged Jewish attempts to get the property back. For example, Czech law initially only allowed for claims after 1948. These laws were later amended to 1938, but not until the 1990s, well after massive Jewish exodus from Europe. Norway also contributed heavily to this issue, withholding full compensation to Jewish families until 1999 for payments that should have occurred in 1945. Elser describes how the Aryanization of Jewish property was largely mitigated in France and Norway. It should be noted that in Norway, reparations were largely limited to no more than 60% of all cases. Outside of France and Norway, however, Jewish families trying to rebuild their lives on the European continent were ultimately forced to accept their losses without legal recourse. This set of legal norms within Europe likely served as a major stimulus to Jewish immigration, and Israel presented itself as a logical choice for the newly dispossessed, but at the expense of Palestinian livelihoods. As the Israeli state began to absorb these immigrants and continue the growth of its urban centers, it enacted laws that supported its own legal possession to claim for the Arab lands. Wolff builds upon the ideas of transitional justice that Elser describes, writing how, in 1967, the Israeli parliament passed bills that made Israeli law the law of the land throughout Jerusalem. These laws to date are largely not recognized by the United States or the United Nations, placing Palestinian claims in a state of perpetual legal limbo. Wolff describes how Israel argues from the standpoint of uti possedites, or as you possess it. This infers that Israel possesses the contested territory simply through the presence of armed forces. This is countervailed by the international community via the legal premise of status quo ante bellum, or the situation as it existed before the outbreak of war. Most often, however, Wolff notes that countries will settle for a peaceful resolution relying upon treaties to normalize a situation. In this case, it was the Treaty of 1994 between Jordan and Israel that prescribed control of Jerusalem and the West Bank to Israel. It is upon this premise that Israel believes it has a legal claim to the use of the land within the West Bank. Yiftachel, Wiener, and Golan all recognize in very oblique terms that the sum of these factors, particularly the lack of proper reparations to the Jews at the end of World War II by the European powers, as described by Elser, were a significant cause for Jewish immigration to Israel. It is likely that transitional and transnational justice issues such as these color Israeli perspectives on justice, particularly with the implicit demand of settler needs, and cause the Israeli state to make little acknowledgement in its laws of Palestinian territorial rights. Section 7. Perceptions. It is within the theme of perception that the crush of humanity in rapidly growing urban centers and the inconsistencies in justice that the threats of conflict and damage to human security begin to arise. Wiener states at best that there are no, quote, clear assumptions or experiences with respect to how a government or international institutions can affect the internal affairs of those governments that cannot prevent violent civil conflicts or are unable or unwilling to protect their own citizens, unquote, especially when there are no clear distinctions between citizens within the complex landmass that is occupied by the Israelis and the Palestinian Arabs. Global powers such as the United States and the United Nations continue to struggle to positively influence the course of events in this long-running conflict, working against the long-established perceptions of not only both parties, but a global village of state and non-state actors. In the early years of this conflict, Palestinian perceptions were likely relatively hopeful compared to the later 20th century. Falk describes in clear terms an idea largely espoused by much of the other literature, that while in the early years there was probably hope, owing in large part to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, actions by states such as Israel showed how the Declaration's basic tenets could quickly unravel. This is because, as Falk argues, that at the time of its creation, too many signatories to this declaration in 1948, quote, were themselves authoritarian and oblivious to the social responsibility of the state to make the implementation of human rights seem as if it were a genuine political project, unquote. As discussed earlier in this literature review, in relation to the lack of any real intention on the part of the Israeli government to meaningfully include Arabs in their urban planning, idealism such as that expressed in the Declaration rarely bore significant fruit. Yiftachil describes how frustration with this sense of injustice grew over time. Oren Yiftachil characterizes the first Palestinian Intifada from 1987 to 1993 as being, quote, accompanied by growing polarization between Palestinian minority inside Israel and the state, unquote. As described earlier by both Wiener and Yiftachil, by 1996 Palestinian Arabs were beginning to remain in place during times of increased conflict, and this was likely the result of increasing galvanization of attitudes and mutually negative perceptions held by both sides. In this way, the growing religious rhetoric that inspires movements like Intifadas was beginning to mask the social issues that accompany urbanization. Later, as Yiftachil further highlights, Israeli attempts in 2000 to annex greater portions of the West Bank to the tune of 10 to 15% of the total landmass of the area were met by increased resistance and begat a, quote, bloodbath, unquote, of violence. The primary Israeli response was to construct a separation barrier based largely upon the perception that Palestinian areas needed to be contained. The spiral of these actions would cut off, by Yiftachil's account, 51,000 acres of Palestinian land and impact over 210,000 lives. The barrier effectively cut off these Palestinian Arabs off from land and from their livelihood, further worsening the situation and sowing the seeds of future conflict. This deteriorating relationship between Israelis and Palestinian Arabs is what has contributed to, as Handelman describes, the increased radicalization of Palestinian Arabs. As the promises of repeatedly stalled peace processes have fallen apart and the hopes for statehood evaporate, Handelman notes that desperation becomes the norm and the conflicts perpetuate themselves. Conclusion. The nexus between urbanization and transitional and transnational justice has rendered the aspirations of the authors of documents such as the Universal Declaration on Human Rights essentially defunct. Falk holds out some hope in that a core tenet of the Declaration, the right to development, is still acknowledged globally. Lacking universal laws and a governing world body, It is this basic idea which must underpin any attempt to reconcile conflicts such as those between the Israelis and Palestinian Arabs. While interstate warfare in the region has decreased in recent history compared to the foundational era of Israel, the threat of it still looms, along with its nascent tendency to create refugees from violence. This literature review has illustrated that while little can be done about the historical facts that have created many of the conditions for this conflict, potential areas to find solutions remain. Their efficacy will be mitigated, however, by the lack of Israeli inclusion of Palestinian Arabs in the urban planning process and the acrimony over injustice and the negative perceptions of both sides, which will not support forward progress. At the least, further research will hopefully provide lessons that can be learned by other states experiencing similar problems from growing urbanizations and help them to create fair policies that address transitional and transnational justice related issues and ideally mitigate the attendant negative perceptions that failing to do so creates. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.